In this video, we take a look at the vintage collection Star Wars figures that debuted on the Return of the Jedi card backs that are still to make it into the modern vintage collection. Hey there Star Wars collectors, and welcome to episode 3 of the Missing Vintage Collection Figures. This is the series where we take a look at the gaps that are still present in the vintage collection, and in case you missed it, I'll leave the link to the episode 1 and 2 in the description below so that you can check those videos out after this one. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video we're going to be looking at the vintage figures that debuted on the Return of the Jedi card backs that are still yet to be released by Hasbro in the modern vintage collection. So before we get started, if you like this video, please hit that like button as it really does support the video. And if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss any future episode. And if you're really feeling generous, share this video on all your favourite social media channels. I'm also interested in your opinions, so let me know in the comments below on which figure that you want the most out of the ones that we're going to be looking at today. With all that being said, let's get straight on to the first figure, which I'm sure you'll agree is a huge gap, and that is of course Bib Fortuna. Now to be quite honest, I'm stunned that this guy wasn't released in the first run of the vintage collection way back in 2010 to 2013. After all, he did have a pretty big role in Return of the Jedi, and he's going to be a big miss for anyone that was lucky enough to get the Jabba's sail barge, or more recently the Jabba's Palace playset. In fact, when the playset was revealed, I was actually quite surprised that they went for Rees and not Bib Fortuna. Anyway, the last time that we did have a Bib Fortuna was in the Saga collection back in 2006, and even though this figure isn't that bad, I would hope that Hasbro would release a new sculpt. I'm just not a fan of the open mouth on this figure. He looks like he's in pain or something, so I really would hope that they'll actually provide a new figure on that classic card back. Moving on to another alien from Jabba's Palace, and again, unbelievable that we haven't had this guy on a vintage collection card. In fact, I'm pretty sure we haven't had an update of this figure since 2001. It is of course Squidhead, or Tessek, which is his actual name. So I actually really like this figure back in the day. It's a great looking figure and a lovely card back too on that Return of the Jedi card. Now he was released as part of the Power of the Jedi line, but this was way before super articulated figures were released, so an update is well overdue. As I'm sure you're aware, Hasbro have kind of been focusing on the Return of the Jedi this year, and in particular figures connected to Jabba the Hutt. So as with the Bib Fortuna, it's a shame that we haven't been able to add Squidhead to our collections. Sticking with Jabba's Palace, next up is the Rancor Keeper. So I admit that this character was only on screen for a few seconds, but again from a point of view of the story and what went down with the Rancor etc, it would be nice to have an updated version on a vintage style card back. This one would be quite an easy one for Hasbro to do, as the figure from the Legacy collection released in 2009 would probably be good enough for a straight repack. As with all Star Wars characters, he does have an actual name, which as you can see on the Legacy collection package is Malakili. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And even though I would prefer the name peel to mimic the original vintage Kenner card, I would let that slide if it meant that we got the figure in the vintage collection sooner rather than later. The final figure from the first act of the film is a droid called 8D8. Now I admit he's not the greatest of figures, and you can actually still pick up the original mint on card for a fairly cheap price. However, trying to find one without the yellow bubble is somewhat more difficult. A lot of the Return of the Jedi card bubbles always go yellow. This must be the type of plastic that they used or something. But correct me if I'm wrong, as the same with Squidhead, it's been a long time since this character has been released. In fact, the last time was way back in 1998 as part of the Power of the Force 2 line. This is the version that came with the torture gizmo that he used to burn the feet of the poor old Gonk droid. So even though it's not high on my list of wanted figures, if we're going to complete the vintage run, then it's still a gap that needs to be filled. Moving away from Jabba's Palace and over to the Forest Moon of Endor. Now love them or hate them, the Ewoks are a big part of the film, and there are a few that were released on the Return of the Jedi cards that are still yet to get the vintage collection treatment. As I'm sure you know, we already have Wicket, Logray and Lumat, but for some reason we don't have the Chief himself, Chief Chirper. I find it strange that there are so many Ewoks in various lines, but Chief Chirper hasn't had an update since the 2006 Saga collection version. And although this version does look pretty good, it does lag behind from an articulation point of view when comparing it to some of the other Ewoks that have been released. So in my opinion, and as far as Ewoks go, Chief Chirper is a pretty big gap in the modern vintage collection, and it's certainly a gap that needs filling. The same goes for Teebo. Now you could argue that Teebo has a bigger part than most of the other Ewoks. He's on the front line when they capture the heroes, plus he also gets into a bit of bother with R2's Zapper. Anyway, I always liked the look of Teebo. The colour of his fur and his menacing headdress with the hog's head always stuck out for me when I was a kid. The most recent and best looking Teebo was released in the Movie Heroes Ewok pack, which was a Toys R Us exclusive, It's a pretty cool set, and T-Bow actually comes with an alternative headdress, which is pretty cool. In terms of articulation, he has everything you would need, and again, this version could probably be repacked straight onto a vintage style card. The last of our Ewoks is Paploo. Now, a lot of people think that this figure, along with Lumat, were part of the last 17 and first released on the Power of the Force cards in 1985, when in actual fact they were indeed released on the Return of the Jedi cards at the back end of 1984, which is why Paploo is included in this video and not in the next episode, where I will be going through the figures from the Power of the Force line. Paploo was released in the 2009 Legacy Collection as part of an Ewok 2-pack, and I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce the name of the other Ewok that's included in that 2-pack, so I'll just show you what he looks like on screen instead. But again, like most of the 2009 Legacy Collection, these figures are highly detailed with all the articulation you would need, so again, a pretty easy repack on a vintage card would fill the gap nicely. Sticking with Endor, we have the AT-ST Scout Walker Driver, another nice figure and card back from back in the day. This is one of those card backs that featured the vehicle rather than the character himself. Now, they did this with others such as the Attack Commander, B-Wing and TIE Fighter Pilot. Pretty sure that they did this with the A-Wing as well. So perhaps at the time the ships were more recognisable than the characters that piloted them, but still, it makes for a nice card back, and the AT-ST Driver is one of those that's still to be released on a single card. Again, a nice easy one for them to put out because they could just repack the figure from the Endor AT-ST Crew 2-pack, which I believe is the same figure that came out in the Black Series AT-ST that was released in 2016. Next up is a figure and card back that again is a huge gap in my opinion, and it's the Emperor. So this is a really strange one for me, as we've had 2 Palpatines in the line already, one on a Phantom Menace card and another one on the Revenge of the Sith card. But surely the one that everyone wants and needs is the Emperor from Return of the Jedi. Such a classic card back and the main villain behind it all. Now, over the years there have been some pretty shocking attempts at this figure, but to be honest, the most recent 5POA version from 2018 is a great looking figure. The sculpt is spot on, so surely they could just modify this mould to include super articulation and boom, you have the definitive Emperor. I think for such a big character in the original trilogy, he deserves to be in the vintage collection on that Return of the Jedi card. From a huge gap to not such a huge gap. Introducing the man with the best hairdo in the galaxy, it is General Madine. Okay, so I admit this guy isn't the most interesting figure out there. I mean, after all, he does have a pointer for an accessory, for heaven's sake. But a gap is a gap, and we will need him to complete the run of original figures. The figure itself needs an update with the most recent version released in 2004 Original Trilogy Collection. Not a great deal to say about this character, so we'll move swiftly on to the next one. Next up we have Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker. Now, I know we've had a few versions of this figure in the vintage collection, but they've never got it quite right. The Deleted Scenes lightsaber construction figure is a very nice figure, but it isn't on the correct card back. The Endor capture figure, which was available with a variant card back that matched the vintage one, isn't accurate either, because at that point of the movie he didn't have the black glove, and also the figure doesn't come with his brown cloak. So to truly get the definitive version, they need to repack the upcoming figure that will be included in the San Diego Comic-Con 3-pack onto the card back that has Luke in Jabba's palace. Now on to 2 figures that have already been released on vintage cards that could just do with an update, both of which are from the 2006 Vintage Saga collection, and the first one up is the Endor Princess Leia. So this is a figure that really does need an update in my opinion. The card back is fine, but the figure itself is just out of date. Now, I'm pretty sure there was also a version in a comic 2-pack in 2008. However, I'm not sure if this is just a repack of that VSC version. Either way, it still needs an update in my opinion. And the same goes for the Biker Scout. So again, a great card back this one of the best. But the figure suffers from a yellowing torso and in general could do with a nice new sculpt. Much like they've recently done with the Rogue One Stormtrooper, I really hope that they do the same for the Biker Scout. So that about wraps it up for this episode, guys. Plenty for Hasbro to do to fill the gaps. Let me know in the comments which of these figures you want the most in your collection. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hit that like button, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next episode, which we will look at the figures released on the Power of the Force card backs. Take it easy everyone, and see you soon.